The crystal chandeliers of the Grand St. Regis Ballroom reflected in hundreds of polished champagne flutes, casting a dazzling, almost blinding glow across the elite of North Carolina's business, real estate, and political upper crust. Soft, elegant jazz played by a live string quartet drifted through the air, creating an atmosphere of effortless opulence. But beneath the diamond necklaces and expensive, tailored suits lay a world built entirely on social posturing, vanity, and calculated appearances. 34-year-old Evelyn Mercer stood just inside the arched doorway, her hand resting lightly on the heavy leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm. She wore a simple, tailored charcoal gray suit, a stark, intentional contrast to the floor-length silk gowns and custom tuxedos surrounding her. 11 years had passed since she last set foot in her family's presence. 11 long years of grueling night classes, quiet sacrifice, and rebuilding a shattered life from the pieces left behind on her father's study floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not out of fear or intimidation, but with the cold, crystalline focus of a seasoned corporate fraud attorney who knew that every single document inside her portfolio was an absolute, unappealable death sentence for the empire her parents had constructed. Around her, servers in white gloves glided through the crowd, carrying trays of caviar and vintage wine, while guests laughed at rehearsed jokes, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire foundation hosting the 65th birthday gala for her father, Arthur Mercer, was nothing more than a hollow financial shell funded by stolen public grants. Evelyn scanned the room, observing the lavish decorations, the golden banners celebrating her father's philanthropic legacy, and the prominent figures who had gathered to pay homage to a man they believed to be a pillar of the community. She felt a profound sense of calm washing over her, knowing that the illusion was about to shatter permanently. She had not come here to make a scene or beg for a place at their table. She had come as an officer of the court to deliver the truth that would strip away their polished masks once and for all. Before Evelyn could take another step into the bustling ballroom, her mother, Eleanor Mercer, turned from a group of wealthy donors and caught sight of her eldest daughter. Eleanor's face, sculpted by decades of high society poise, flawless makeup, and expensive cosmetic procedures, instantly hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She marched across the marble floor, her heavy emerald silk dress rustling loudly against the quiet hum of conversation. And before Evelyn could utter a single word of greeting, Eleanor raised her jeweled hand and struck her daughter across the face. The sharp, violent crack of the slap echoed through the immediate vicinity, turning the faces of nearly 200 horrified guests toward the scene in stunned silence. The sheer force of the blow turned Evelyn's head sideways, a stinging heat burning across her cheek. Yet her grip on the leather portfolio beneath her arm never loosened for a fraction of a second. Before the murmuring of the crowd could swell into loud questions, Arthur Mercer hurried over, his face flushed with irritation and embarrassment. He did not ask if his daughter was hurt, nor did he offer a single word of comfort or parental concern. Instead, he grabbed Evelyn's elbow with a crushing, bruised grip, leaning in close so only she could hear his furious, hissed whisper. "Get out of here right now, through the kitchen service door," Arthur snarled, his eyes cold and devoid of a single drop of affection. "Don't you dare embarrass this family again in front of our esteemed guests." Standing just behind them, Evelyn's 30-year-old sister, Audrey, stood wearing the heirloom diamond necklace that had once belonged to their late grandmother. Audrey adjusted her silk strap, a subtle, triumphant smirk playing across her lips, as two private security guards closed in around Evelyn to enforce her father's command. Audrey had always thrived in the shadow of her parents' favoritism, enjoying the status and luxury that came with being the compliant, obedient daughter. And watching Evelyn being humiliated in public was a spectacle she had anticipated for over a decade. The two burly security guards reached out to grab Evelyn's arms, intent on escorting her out like a common trespasser through the back service corridor. But before their heavy fingers could touch the fabric of her suit jacket, a heavy wooden chair scraped sharply across the marble floor at the head table near the stage. Governor Jonathan Hayes stood up from his seat, buttoning his navy suit jacket with slow, deliberate authority. The entire ballroom fell into a sudden, breathless silence as the state's most powerful political figure stepped away from the main stage and walked directly toward the tense group. He ignored the whispering guests, bypassed the frozen security guards, and stopped directly in front of Arthur Mercer. Governor Hayes looked at the trembling patriarch, his expression unreadable and cold, before asking a single sharp question that cut through the room like a razor. "Do you have any idea who she is, Arthur?" Arthur's confident, domineering posture instantly faltered under the governor's stern gaze. He forced a strained, painful smile beneath the harsh glare of the chandeliers, trying to laugh it off as a minor, unfortunate domestic misunderstanding. But his eyes darted nervously down to the heavy leather portfolio tucked beneath Evelyn's arm. For the very first time that night, Evelyn watched the arrogant contempt in her father's eyes melt away, replaced by a sudden, terrifying flicker of recognition and deep-seated fear. Arthur was a man who lived by optics and influence, a man who believed he could control every room he entered. But he instantly understood that the governor's presence was not a friendly endorsement of his birthday celebration. Governor Hayes had not come to drink his wine or praise his charitable foundation. He was standing beside the very woman whose legal team had spent 6 months preparing an airtight federal financial crime case against Mercer Global and its corrupt subsidiary accounts. Looking at her father's pale, trembling face, Evelyn felt her mind drift back 11 years to the night her family had systematically erased her from their lives. She had been 23 years old, terrified, and standing in her father's dimly lit study after discovering she was pregnant with her daughter. Her father, expanding his real estate holdings into political consulting, viewed her unexpected pregnancy not as a new life to be cherished, but as a catastrophic public relations emergency that threatened the pristine family portrait they sold to wealthy donors and corporate investors. They never asked if she was scared, if she needed medical care, or if the baby's father had abandoned her when he learned the news. Instead, Arthur had placed 3 crisp documents on his mahogany desk: an appointment confirmation at an expensive private clinic, a binding non-disclosure agreement, and a one-way flight ticket to Europe. Her mother had looked at her with cold detachment, telling her she could return home only when the problem had been permanently handled out of sight. When Evelyn quietly but firmly refused to terminate her pregnancy, Arthur removed her from the family trust before sunrise, stripping her of her name, her inheritance, and her future. From the doorway, a young Audrey had watched the entire confrontation in silence, later telling relatives, business partners, and society reporters that Evelyn had stolen family funds and fled the state in disgrace. That single, calculated lie allowed her parents to explain her sudden disappearance without ever admitting to the social circle they worshipped that they had heartlessly abandoned their pregnant daughter on the street because she refused to sacrifice her child for their corporate brand. In the grueling months that followed her exile, Evelyn learned the true meaning of resilience and self-reliance. She slept on a threadbare mattress in a friend's cramped laundry room, working grueling 12-hour night shifts at a legal records storage facility while attending community college classes during the day. Through sheer, unrelenting willpower, she carried her daughter Chloe into the world alone, studying case law beside her newborn's crib under the dim glow of a desk lamp, while managing high fevers and unpaid utility bills. Her fierce determination paid off when she earned a full merit scholarship to law school, eventually clawing her way up to become one of the state's most formidable corporate fraud litigators. For 11 long years, her family never once reached out to ask if their granddaughter was fed, healthy, or warm, yet they routinely used Evelyn's absence to fuel their own virtuous public narratives. Audrey gave interviews claiming she had selflessly stepped up to lead the family foundation after her unstable older sister caused a scandal, while Eleanor gave speeches on protecting vulnerable young women, all while returning every unopened envelope containing baby photographs of Chloe. Arthur allowed newspapers to describe him as a grieving father whose eldest child had vanished into a dark life of addiction. Sitting alone in her small apartment years ago, watching Chloe draw pictures at the kitchen table, Evelyn had realized that her family's cruelty was not a sudden mistake, but a systematic way of life. Now, standing in the center of their sparkling ballroom, surrounded by the very people they lived to impress, Evelyn knew that her years of silent survival were over, and the time for total, unyielding accountability had finally arrived. 6 months before her quiet arrival at the Grand St. Regis Ballroom, Evelyn sat in her glass-walled law office in downtown Charlotte, staring at a weathered cardboard box resting on her mahogany desk. The box had been brought in by Samantha Vance, the former finance director of the Mercer Family Renewal Foundation, who had been abruptly terminated after attempting to audit internal accounts. Samantha was a meticulous, middle-aged accountant with decades of nonprofit experience, and her trembling hands revealed the immense pressure she had been under before seeking legal protection. Inside the box lay reams of printed donor statements, bank transaction logs, and internal email threads spanning nearly a decade of corporate operations. Samantha explained that millions of dollars, specifically designated for emergency housing programs, women's shelters, and youth vocational grants, had been systematically funneled into private consulting firms owned by Audrey Mercer and several of Arthur's political associates. When Samantha brought these discrepancy reports to Audrey's attention, expecting an internal review, she was immediately accused of gross professional misconduct, escorted out by security, and threatened with civil litigation. Samantha knew that the family planned to purge the remaining digital servers during the upcoming 65th birthday gala to erase the paper trail permanently. Evelyn had initially considered referring the case to another firm due to the obvious personal conflict of interest. But as she began flipping through the financial ledgers, her eyes locked onto a document that turned her blood to ice. Nestled deep within the stack of financial records was a certified bank authorization form dated 11 years earlier, the exact week Evelyn had been thrown out into the rain. The document detailed an initial wire transfer of $1.8 million from a state-funded youth housing reserve into a newly formed commercial holding account. Printed clearly across the bottom of the form was Evelyn's full legal name, accompanied by a sharp, sweeping signature authorizing the release of the funds. Evelyn leaned down, her fingers tracing the black ink on the page, staring at the signature until her eyes burned. It was a sophisticated forgery, but it contained a subtle, distinct habit that only someone who had grown up with her would recognize. The final letter N in her name curled sharply upward at the end. It was Audrey's signature habit, an artistic flourish her younger sister had practiced copying on high school permission slips and notebook covers when they were teenagers. In that single, shattering moment, the full horror of her family's grand design unraveled before Evelyn's eyes. Her parents had not merely exiled her out of arrogant social shame or moral condemnation for her unplanned pregnancy. They had meticulously preserved her name as a permanent, institutional scapegoat. The forged authorization was designed to ensure that if state auditors or federal investigators ever uncovered the missing millions, the disgraced, banished daughter would take the fall for the entire enterprise. The realization hit Evelyn like a physical blow, illuminating the dark machinery behind every cruel rumor her family had spread over the past decade. The fabricated stories about her alleged drug addiction, her financial instability, and her supposed theft of family heirlooms were not random acts of petty malice. They were calculated legal insurance. By systematically ruining her reputation in the eyes of their relatives, donors, and the press, Arthur and Eleanor had created a convincing public narrative that made her the perfect suspect for financial crimes. If auditors ever came knocking at the doors of Mercer Global, Arthur could simply point to the court records, produce the forged signature, and, weeping publicly, claim that his troubled eldest daughter had stolen from the charity before vanishing into the shadows. The sheer sociopathic patience required to maintain such a trap for 11 years left Evelyn breathless with cold rage. They had gambled with her freedom, her career, and her daughter's future without a single shred of remorse. She realized then that her family's version of love was nothing more than a high-risk transaction where people were used until they became inconvenient and then converted into liabilities to protect the family brand. Looking at her daughter Chloe's drawing pinned to her office wall, Evelyn knew she could no longer remain passive. It was no longer just about surviving their exile. It was about dismantling a predatory machine before it destroyed her life a second time. Evelyn immediately formally disclosed her familial connection to the state attorney general's office, submitting the verified documents through official legal channels to maintain absolute professional integrity. Recognizing the scale of the financial crimes, the State Financial Crimes Integrity Task Force launched a confidential forensic audit, spearheaded by investigators who had worked with Evelyn on previous corporate fraud prosecutions. Over the next 5 months, forensic accountants meticulously mapped the flow of stolen capital through a web of sophisticated shell companies, inflated vendor invoices, and private real estate purchases linked to Mercer Global. What they uncovered far exceeded Samantha's initial suspicions. Over $14 million in public and private charitable donations had been systematically drained over 9 years. To ensure the case was rock solid, Evelyn reached out to Governor Jonathan Hayes, a principled public servant who had long championed financial transparency in state-funded nonprofits. Governor Hayes had been invited months earlier to attend Arthur's birthday gala as a guest of honor to announce a major state partnership with the foundation. Upon reviewing the task force's preliminary findings, Governor Hayes privately canceled the state partnership, while keeping his name on the guest list. His presence at the gala was a deliberate, strategic maneuver to ensure that Arthur could not use his political connections to suppress the investigation once the evidence was laid bare. As the months of covert investigation drew to a close, the task force traced the missing $14 million directly into luxury assets that sustained her family's lavish lifestyle. The stolen funds had financed Audrey's luxury high-rise condominium in downtown Charlotte, her private jet travel, her European vacations, and a private yacht club membership disguised on accounting ledgers as community outreach initiatives. Arthur had used portions of the money to bribe local zoning officials for his commercial real estate developments, while Eleanor used charity accounts to pay for elaborate home renovations, high-end designer wardrobes, and the very ballroom gala they were currently throwing. Whenever local community organizers asked why the promised shelters and vocational centers were never built, Eleanor smoothly attributed the delays to bureaucratic permits, supply chain shortages, or staffing difficulties, hosting glamorous luncheons to reassure donors that their money was safe. Sitting with her legal team the night before the gala, reviewing the final mountain of bank statements, property deeds, and recorded phone calls, Evelyn felt no desire for chaotic revenge. She was an officer of the law, and she had built an unassailable fortress of facts. Her parents had spent 11 years using her name to cover their crimes, but tomorrow night, under the bright lights of the St. Regis Ballroom, that very same name would be the instrument that brought their entire fraudulent empire crashing to the ground. Arthur Mercer attempted to break the suffocating silence that had fallen over the ballroom, forcing a dry, nervous laugh as he stepped between Governor Hayes and Evelyn. "Governor, please, this is nothing more than an unfortunate domestic misunderstanding," Arthur said, his voice straining to maintain its usual polished authority in front of the 400 watching guests. "Evelyn has been estranged from our family for over a decade due to her own personal struggles, and she is clearly seeking to create a public spectacle on my birthday." Governor Hayes did not smile, nor did he move an inch. Instead, he reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out an official document bearing the gold crest of the state Supreme Court. "This stopped being a private family matter the moment your foundation submitted falsified financial affidavits to the state government, Arthur," Governor Hayes announced, his voice echoing clearly across the hushed ballroom. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division issued an emergency court injunction freezing every corporate account, real estate trust, and liquid asset associated with Mercer Global and the Mercer Family Renewal Foundation." A collective gasp swept through the crowd as several prominent donors immediately lowered their champagne glasses, exchanging shocked, panicked whispers. Before Eleanor or Arthur could offer another desperate protest, 2 plainclothes agents from the State Financial Crimes Task Force stepped forward from the rear of the hall, carrying a heavy metal case. At a nod from Governor Hayes, they connected an encrypted laptop directly to the ballroom's main audiovisual system, which had been set up earlier to play a tribute video celebrating Arthur's philanthropic legacy. At Evelyn's signal, the giant projection screens hanging above the stage flickered, replacing the smiling promotional photographs with high-definition scanned bank ledgers and forensic audit reports. The first slide displayed the forged $1.8 million authorization form, bearing Evelyn's altered signature from 11 years ago, side by side with recent wire transfers moving public housing grants into Audrey's private shell companies. The second slide played a crystal-clear audio recording captured by Samantha Vance during an executive meeting, broadcasting Eleanor's cold, unmistakable voice through the ballroom speakers. "People don't give money for accounting details, Samantha. They give money for the story we tell them. Clean up those numbers and stop acting as if anyone actually wants the truth." A wave of horror and disgust rippled through the audience as the full extent of the fraud was exposed in real time before Charlotte's most influential leaders. One wealthy philanthropist in the front row recognized the name of a battered women's shelter he had personally funded with a $500,000 check, only to see on the screen that the money had been redirected within 48 hours to pay for Audrey's private jet charter to Paris. A prominent hospital administrator who had served on the foundation's board for 12 years stood up, unpinned her gold Mercer charity emblem with trembling hands, and placed it quietly on the tablecloth before walking out of the hall. Eleanor's face drained of all color as she watched her lifelong social circle, the very people whose admiration she had sacrificed her daughter to secure, turn away from her in open contempt. She lunged toward the technician operating the AV equipment, shouting frantically for them to turn off the screens. But 2 state officers stepped smoothly into her path, informing her politely that the equipment was now seized evidence under an active federal court order. Sensing his entire life's work disintegrating in front of his peers, Arthur turned on Evelyn, his eyes blazing with desperate, furious bravado. He pointed an accusing finger at her, shouting that any documents she possessed were protected under the strict non-disclosure agreements she had signed prior to leaving the family. She is violating attorney-client privilege and corporate non-disclosure contracts, Arthur yelled frantically toward the news reporters at the back of the room. These documents are stolen corporate property. Evelyn stepped forward, her posture straight, her voice calm and completely unshakable as she pulled a red-sealed legal order from her portfolio. An NDA cannot be used as a legal shield to conceal ongoing criminal activity or institutional fraud, Arthur. Evelyn stated with razor-sharp precision that silenced her father instantly. This afternoon, Judge Rebecca Vance of the Federal District Court granted full whistleblower protection under federal law, completely nullifying any forced agreements from 11 years ago. You didn't build a corporate fortress, Arthur. You built a prison of your own evidence, and every single brick is on those screens. Eleanor stepped up beside her husband, her voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of rage and wounded pride as she stared at her eldest daughter. You would do this to your own father on his 65th birthday? Eleanor hissed, her eyes brimming with bitter tears. You would humiliate your own mother in front of our closest friends after everything we gave you? Evelyn looked at the woman who had struck her across the face just minutes earlier, feeling no desire for petty vengeance, but only a deep, profound clarity. You chose the venue, Mother, Evelyn replied softly, her voice echoing through the silent room. You invited the donors whose money you stole. You invited the journalists who praised your fake generosity. And you built this magnificent stage to celebrate yourselves. I didn't create your destruction. I simply stepped onto the stage you provided and allowed the truth to speak. Behind her, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom swung open once more, admitting uniformed state troopers who took their positions along the exits, ensuring that no documents, electronic devices, or key figures could leave the premises before formal questioning began. Faced with the immediate prospect of federal indictment and absolute public ruin, Arthur Mercer's lifelong survival instinct kicked in, casting aside any lingering illusion of paternal instinct or family unity. He lunged back toward the lectern, grabbed the microphone with trembling hands, and cleared his throat in a desperate attempt to regain control of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm, Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking with panic as he looked out at the stone-faced crowd. What you are seeing on these screens is the result of internal corporate malfeasance that I personally uncovered only recently. As chairman, I admit I was overly trusting, but the individual who held direct administrative control over the foundation's daily transfers was my younger daughter, Audrey. I was completely unaware that she was misusing corporate funds, and I have already instructed our legal team to cooperate fully with state authorities. The entire ballroom gasped in shock at the sheer, unvarnished coldness of his betrayal. Sitting in the front row, Audrey froze, her face turning chalk white as she stared at her father in total, disbelieving horror. The father who had spoiled her, praised her compliance, and used her to replace Evelyn for 11 years, had just publicly sacrificed her on national television to save his own skin. The illusion of Audrey's favored status shattered instantly, unleashing a wave of bitter, volcanic rage that had been building beneath her polished exterior for years. Shaking with fury, Audrey marched onto the stage, snatched a wireless microphone from a staff table, and shouted directly over her father's voice. "You lying coward!" Audrey screamed, her eyes wide with tears of betrayal, as 400 guests watched in breathless silence. "You approved every single wire transfer! You forced me to set up those consulting firms when I was 22 years old, telling me it was standard tax planning. Every time a grant came in, you sat in your office with Mother and decided which shelter wouldn't get funded so we could pay off the mortgage on the lakefront estate? Eleanor rushed toward the stage, pleading frantically with Audrey to be quiet and stop ruining their family name. But Audrey turned on her mother with equal venom, exposing how Eleanor had personally directed staff to digitally edit photos of dilapidated warehouses to fool donors into believing they were operational women's centers. The celebrated Mercer family, once featured in glossy magazines as the epitome of Southern elegance and moral leadership, devolved into an ugly, screaming match over who had signed which lie, tearing each other apart before the very society they had lived to impress. As the chaotic shouting match escalated, Samantha Vance stepped out from the audience, accompanied by an investigator from the Attorney General's office. Samantha carried a pristine silver hard drive, the original, unedited backup server that Audrey had ordered her to wipe 6 months prior. At a signal from the state prosecutors, the audio technician played a newly decrypted voice file recorded during an executive board meeting 2 years earlier. Arthur's distinct, commanding voice resonated through the ballroom speakers, clear and undeniable. Evelyn is gone, and her name is still listed on the old trust authorization forms. Use her signature for the secondary shell transfers. If auditors ever question the discrepancies, everyone will easily believe that a disgruntled, estranged daughter took the money before she fled. Eleanor's voice immediately followed on the recording. Make sure the dates on those forged wire confirmations match the exact week we removed her from the trust. It will look like an admission of guilt. Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Audrey lowered her microphone, slumping against the podium as the final, indisputable proof of their decade-long conspiracy echoed off the high ceilings. No legal maneuver, political connection, or public relations spin could survive the cold reality of their own recorded words. The financial and social fallout was immediate, brutal, and completely unyielding. Within minutes of the audio recording playing, the chairman of Mercer Global's board of directors stepped into the corridor and called an emergency meeting, officially suspending Arthur from all executive duties and revoking his corporate access. Representatives from 3 major corporate sponsors immediately announced the cancellation of their multi-million-dollar endowments, while a local university president issued a press release pausing the naming dedication of their new business school facility. In the back of the room, several high-net-worth investors slipped out into the foyer to instruct their wealth managers to freeze all joint ventures with the Mercer family. Outside the ballroom doors, news crews that had arrived to cover a routine society gala were now broadcasting live updates about the federal raid on Mercer Global. The empire that Arthur and Eleanor had spent 40 years building did not collapse with a grand explosion. It severed itself piece by piece, relationship by relationship, as every fair-weather friend, political ally, and business partner scrambled to cut ties with the disgraced family. Lead state police investigators stepped onto the stage, pulling steel handcuffs from their belts as the 400 guests watched in solemn, heavy silence. Arthur Mercer, Eleanor Mercer, and Audrey Mercer, the lead detective announced, his voice carrying clearly over the PA system. You are under arrest for federal financial fraud, grand larceny, document forgery, and criminal conspiracy. As the officers turned Arthur around and clicked the cold metal cuffs around his wrists, the proud patriarch turned his head toward Evelyn one last time, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror, humiliation, and burning regret. Eleanor wept bitterly as she was led down the carpeted steps, her emerald gown dragging on the floor, while Audrey walked in numb, silent shock, her designer necklace glinting under the lights. Evelyn stood at the center of the room, her posture straight, her hand resting calmly on her leather portfolio. Beside her stood Governor Hayes and Samantha Vance, forming a wall of quiet integrity. There was no smug satisfaction or petty glee in Evelyn's eyes, only a profound, peaceful stillness. She had not sought to destroy her family out of hatred. She had simply refused to allow their lies to define her worth or ruin more innocent lives. As the police escorted the 3 disgraced figures out through the main doors, the remaining guests erupted into a quiet, unanimous standing ovation for the woman who had stood up for the truth. In the months following the explosive night at the Grand St. Regis, the machinery of the American federal justice system moved with relentless, uncompromising precision against Arthur, Eleanor, and Audrey Mercer. Faced with an unassailable mountain of forensic accounting evidence, encrypted tape recordings, and authenticated wire transfer logs, their high-priced defense attorneys quickly realized that a trial would only result in maximum statutory penalties. Arthur entered a guilty plea to federal financial fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy, receiving a mandatory 12-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Audrey, who agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors to reduce her exposure, was sentenced to 6 years in a state facility, along with court-ordered restitution that liquidated her luxury assets. Eleanor faced separate federal charges for donor misrepresentation and evidence tampering, receiving a 4-year sentence. Furthermore, the civil courts issued a sweeping decree under elder and vulnerable adult exploitation statutes, legally revoking every matrimonial asset claim, trust entitlement, and corporate indemnity associated with Mercer Global. Their primary residence, the grand stone mansion where Arthur had planned to celebrate his legacy, was placed on the public auction block to repay millions in stolen public grants. For Evelyn, watching their institutional collapse was not an exercise in vindictive glee, but a quiet, necessary closure to a dark chapter, proving that justice is not a weapon of revenge, but a restorative boundary that protects the innocent from the parasitic greed of those who believe they are above the law. 3 weeks before her sister was scheduled to begin her sentence at a regional correctional facility, Audrey requested an official visitation meeting with Evelyn. The meeting took place in Evelyn's private law office, a quiet, neutral environment far removed from courtroom drama and family politics. Audrey arrived accompanied by her defense counsel, completely stripped of the diamond necklaces, custom-tailored dresses, and smug arrogance that had defined her at the gala. Sitting across the mahogany table, Audrey looked small, hollow, and visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she held a paper cup of water. "I spent my entire life competing with you, Evelyn," Audrey confessed, her voice barely above a whisper as tears pooled in her eyes. "Our parents raised me to believe that only one daughter could be valued at a time. When you got pregnant and refused to leave, I saw a chance to finally become the favorite. But I realized too late that being the favorite only meant becoming their most useful tool. By the time I understood what they were doing to us, I had built my whole identity around winning a game that was rigged from the start." Evelyn listened quietly, her posture erect and poised, feeling no wave of anger, but only a deep, melancholic pity for the sister who had traded her integrity for conditional love. "Understanding why you became cruel explains your choices, Audrey," Evelyn said with quiet, unshakable clarity. "But it does not make that cruelty mine to forgive. You didn't have to love me. You only had to refuse to frame me." When Audrey asked if they could ever be real sisters again, Evelyn looked at her with steady, honest eyes. "Forgiveness, if it comes, is a personal healing process, not a restoration of access. Some people apologize because they finally see the damage. Others apologize because the damage has finally reached them. Time will reveal which one you are." Shortly after the criminal convictions were finalized, a prison chaplain delivered a handwritten letter to Evelyn's office on behalf of Arthur Mercer. In the letter, Arthur claimed that his health was rapidly deteriorating behind bars and demanded that Evelyn bring her 11-year-old daughter, Chloe, to visit him before it was too late. He wrote passionately about a grandfather's sacred right to know his bloodline, insisting that family ties transcended legal disputes and that Chloe deserved to know the man whose name had built the city's skyline. Evelyn did not react with anger or emotional volatility. Instead, she brought the letter home and sat down with Chloe at their sunlit kitchen table. Chloe, now a remarkably intuitive, observant 11-year-old with a passion for art and a sharp, independent mind, read her grandfather's words carefully. She looked up at her mother and asked a single, penetrating question that cut through decades of family manipulation. "Mom, did he ever ask how I was doing during those 11 years when we had no money? Or did he only remember I existed when he needed something from us?" Evelyn looked into her daughter's clear eyes and answered with absolute honesty. "No, sweetie. He never asked." Chloe gently pushed the letter back across the table, her decision swift, mature, and entirely unprompted. "Then I don't need to visit him," Chloe said softly. "A grandfather isn't someone who remembers you only when his own world falls apart." Sitting beside her daughter, Evelyn felt a profound surge of maternal pride, knowing that Chloe possessed a natural clarity and self-respect that no amount of Mercer family wealth could ever buy. A week later, Eleanor Mercer sent a separate, formal petition through her legal counsel. Attached to a tear-stained personal apology for the slap at the gala was a drafted public statement. Eleanor requested that Evelyn sign the document, which claimed that Eleanor had acted under the severe psychological coercion and financial control of her husband throughout their 30-year marriage. Even in her formal apology, Eleanor was frantically drafting an escape route, attempting to use her daughter's newly restored public credibility as a shield against her own criminal culpability. The letter promised that if Evelyn signed the statement, Eleanor would publicly declare Chloe as her legitimate granddaughter, establish an educational trust in her name, and welcome her into future family inheritances once the legal storms cleared. 11 years earlier, a younger, desperate Evelyn might have given everything she owned just to hear her mother acknowledge her child's existence. But sitting in her office as an established attorney and a devoted mother, the offer sounded like nothing more than another cold, transactional contract drafted in desperation. Evelyn picked up her pen, wrote a single sentence on the cover page. "My daughter's dignity was validated the day she was born, not when you needed her to save your reputation," and instructed her paralegal to return the entire packet to Eleanor's attorney without further comment. That evening, sitting on the quiet porch of her suburban home while Chloe painted landscapes in the living room, Evelyn reflected on the long, agonizing road that had brought her to this moment of absolute peace. For 11 years, her family had treated her pregnancy as a scandal, her independence as an insult, and her existence as a convenient scapegoat for their corporate crimes. They had assumed that their power, wealth, and social standing gave them the right to dictate who belonged at their table and who was cast into the cold. But in trying to destroy her, they had unwittingly forced her to build an unshakable foundation within herself, a foundation rooted in honest work, fierce maternal love, and uncompromising integrity. They had tried to remove her from the gala because they believed they still controlled the door to her life, never realizing that she had stopped asking for their invitation years ago. As the warm evening breeze rustled the trees around her home, Evelyn made her final, definitive choice about the people who had abandoned her. True healing did not require reopening doors to toxic relationships under the guise of obligation or blood. She realized that setting boundaries was not an act of hatred, but an act of self-preservation and love for her child. Evelyn locked the door to her past, took a deep, peaceful breath, and threw away the key, knowing her family was finally completely free. In the quiet, productive months that followed the total dissolution of the Mercer Family Renewal Foundation, Evelyn turned her formidable legal expertise and renewed energy toward constructing a lasting legacy rooted in genuine integrity. Operating out of her expanded practice in downtown Charlotte, she partnered with the State Bar Association to establish a specialized, nonprofit legal clinic dedicated exclusively to supporting corporate whistleblowers and individuals whose financial identities had been stolen or forged. Samantha Vance, bringing her decades of forensic accounting expertise and unblemished professional standards, joined the initiative as chief financial advisor, helping vulnerable employees safely report corporate malfeasance without fear of retaliatory destruction. The clinic quickly became a beacon of hope for working-class families across the state, offering pro bono legal representation to honest workers who faced predatory corporate structures. For Evelyn, guiding these courageous individuals through the legal system was not merely a professional duty, but a deeply personal mission of restoration. She knew firsthand how terrifying it felt to stand alone against a powerful, well-funded institution determined to crush your voice. And providing those survivors with a protective shield gave her a profound sense of purpose that no corporate paycheck or social title could ever match. The tens of millions of dollars recovered through state civil enforcement actions and court-ordered asset liquidations were officially redirected under independent judicial supervision to fulfill the promises her family had broken. Rather than allowing the capital to dissolve into bureaucratic administrative fees, the court appointed an independent oversight board to complete the construction of the long-promised women's shelters and emergency housing facilities. The first completed facility, a state-of-the-art residential center offering comprehensive trauma counseling, vocational training, and childcare services, officially opened its doors in downtown Charlotte on a sunlit Saturday morning. Significantly, no golden banners bearing the Mercer name adorned the building's facade, and no self-serving speeches were made to wealthy donors over glasses of champagne. Instead, the women who would live and heal within its walls gathered to name the facility themselves, choosing to call it Harbor House. Standing among the social workers, nurses, and residents on opening day, Evelyn felt an overwhelming wave of quiet fulfillment wash over her. The hollow, fictional stories her mother had sold to high society donors had finally been replaced by solid brick, warm beds, and genuine human compassion. On the afternoon following the dedication ceremony, Evelyn and Chloe visited Harbor House to help prepare the children's reading room before the first families moved in. The room was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight, its shelves lined with donated books, wooden toys, and soft velvet cushions. 11-year-old Chloe, her face lit with pure, unbridled joy, spent hours painting a vibrant blue wave along the bottom of the reading room wall, her hands covered in bright acrylic paint as she laughed cheerfully with her mother. Sitting on the floor beside her daughter, helping her touch up the edges of the painted ocean, Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Chloe's radiant, confident smile. This was the child her family had deemed an embarrassing PR emergency, the child they had demanded she abandon in exchange for a trust fund and a seat at their pretentious table. Yet, growing up far removed from the toxic atmosphere of Mercer Global, Chloe had blossomed into a deeply empathetic, brilliant, and self-assured young artist who knew her worth was unconditional. Watching Chloe paint, Evelyn realized that true wealth had nothing to do with heirloom diamond necklaces or seats beside governors at black tie galas. It was found in the quiet, unshakable peace of knowing that your child's future had been built on honest ground. As autumn set in, painting the trees around her suburban home in rich shades of crimson and amber, Evelyn spent long evenings sitting on her back porch, writing in her personal journal, and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had reshaped her life. She realized that the true measure of a woman's resilience was never found in the flawless execution of an easy, privileged life, nor in the accumulation of corporate titles, but in the quiet, courageous decision to stand up after being stripped of everything. Being abandoned at 23 had not broken her spirit. It had burned away the superficial noise of her life, forcing her to confront her core values and discover an indomitable well of inner strength she might never have uncovered otherwise. Her 34 years had been divided by a single catastrophic night in her father's study, but that tragedy had not destroyed her narrative. It had redefined it. She no longer viewed her past exile with sorrow or resentment, but as the necessary crucible that had transformed her into an authentic leader, a fierce advocate for justice, and an uncompromising mother. She had successfully dismantled a predatory corporate empire brick by brick, but her greatest architectural masterpiece was the peaceful, unshakable soul she had constructed inside her own chest. As the evening sun began its slow, breathtaking descent toward the horizon, casting a golden tapestry of light across the quiet neighborhood, Evelyn walked out to the backyard, where Chloe was sitting on a wooden bench, sketching the autumn leaves. A soft, cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the fresh scent of pine and pine needles. Evelyn sat down beside her daughter, placing a warm arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the sky shift from brilliant gold to deep, serene violet. Looking at their reflection mirrored in the quiet stillness of the evening, Evelyn felt no lingering bitterness toward the family that had cast her out. No residue of fear, and no regret. Every painful step she had taken alone through the dark, every midnight study session, and every tear she had shed had led her directly to this moment of absolute, undisturbed peace. True legacy, she understood, was never something inherited from toxic institutions or preserved through deceptive appearances. It was something earned through truth, nurtured with unconditional love, and rebuilt with unyielding integrity. Evelyn took a deep, peaceful breath of the crisp evening air, feeling a radiant warmth fill her heart, knowing with absolute certainty that her life story was no longer defined by the family that rejected her, but by the honest, beautiful world she had built for herself and her daughter.